Kia ora and welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. My name is Rachel and I'm a student here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. I'm here with my co-host Matthew Bartlett, a Christian chaplain here at Vic, and today we are interviewing Michael Toy.
Michael is a teaching fellow at the university. He's doing his PhD on digital religion and he lectures in religious studies. He's here to chat about faith in the digital age, misinformation, and loving our online neighbours.
It was actually during one of Michael's religious studies courses that this podcast became a dream of ours, and we realised that we wanted to continue some of the amazing conversations that we were having in our classes. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
It's super fun. We've been really enjoying getting to have conversations with different individuals and just feeling like we're learning a lot from all of these experts. Would you be happy to just do a little introduction? Tell us about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Michael Toy. I wear several hats right now. Right now I'm in the process of doing a PhD here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington in religious studies, looking at digital religion, specifically the experiences of minority Christians online and how they navigate theology and politics and power structures of digital systems.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about like minority Christians? What those groups are?
Yeah. So there's a scholar, Richard Garner, up in Auckland, and he's huge in digital theology. And a few years ago, he put out a piece just saying, we have all of these kind of think pieces from white Christians about digitality and the internet, and very, very few people have gone and asked people of color, disabled people, what makes your experience of the digital unique, and what are you bringing to it, and what are you taking away, and how can we come together and create a global Christian community that helps each other flourish. And I was really inspired by that article and thought, that's something that I want to do as someone who is a person of color. I'm Chinese American, third generation immigrant to the U.S. and now first generation immigrant to Aotearoa. So as someone who is tauiwi, learning how to be a good treaty partner, learning how to be someone who is tanata tariti. It's really important to me to think reflectively about how to do that in a Christian way and how to do that in a material way and also in a digital way. And so material, I just mean things, quote, in real life, right? Like things you can touch, taste, see, smell. And then, also how that connects to the digital world.
What is digital theology?
Yeah, digital theology. So that's a contested definition. There's a guy, he's in the UK, and he's given kind of a four-pronged answer to that. And I'm not going to be able to remember all four prongs of that. But one of them looks at the ways that digital structures affect the way that we read scripture. So that's looking at archiving and digitizing manuscripts, the power of AI, and even just the way we can send out these manuscripts to everybody, anyone in the world, just by a scan and some OCR technology. Then there's the reflection upon the way digital infrastructure and structures shape the way that we think about theology. And then there's the way that theology shapes the way we think about digital structures and digital life. So I'm missing one definition, but I think it's probably folded into one of those. Yeah.
It reminds me of, I can't remember the name of the author, but a talk I listened to a very long time ago called Faith in the Age of the iPod. This was, I guess, one thing that digital maybe could do to theology was chop it up into little bits, and where we have a kind of bricolage of, like this from this tradition, this from this tradition. It's sort of like a shuffle rather than having albums or CDs or records. But I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking of when you talk about digital theology. Or
Yeah, definitely thinking about that. I think the way I think about things is a little bit more theoretical, kind of falls more into a philosophy of technology framework. So looking at the sum of all of our technologies, what does it do to the way we live our life? What does it do to our society? How does it shape our relationship with ourselves? How does it really shape our relationship with community? How does it shape our relationship with God, who we think of as God? Now we live with our iPhones or smartphones or whatever it is in our pockets, so we can be omniscient, omnipresent, pretty much omnipotent, just from a control of a button, depending on the back round of the technology or back in technology. But these are the classical attributes of God and the divine, right? So what does it mean now for us to be in this position of creating artificial intelligences where we can imagine all different possible futures, something that before has only been relegated to the divine and the sovereign and the omniscience of God. So how does that in turn shape the way that our lives unfold? I guess Jacques Ellul, he was a French philosopher, theologian, and he calls it technique, right? So all of technology works towards certain ends, and that is of efficiency and self-propagation, so production. And all technologies, however they're used, lend themselves to those things. And so what does it mean to be Christian in an age where everything is pushing us towards efficiency, right? So Koyama, the Japanese theologian, talks about the 3-mile-an-hour God. So, humans walk at 3 miles an hour. Jesus probably walked at 3 miles an hour, roughly. I know we're in Aotearoa and we use kilometers. I don't know. 5K, 5 kilometer an hour God. So what does it mean, right? To walk that slowly, to live life at that creaturely level, right? Of without cars, without e-bikes, without scooters. What does it mean to live life slowly and not to prize efficiency above all else and production above all else?
I wonder if there's a slow faith movement like the slow food movement of a few years ago.
Yeah, I reckon there should be if there isn't one.
I did hear something about humans can only actually take in to a degree the experiences that they have at walking pace. I noticed a huge difference when I was down in Christchurch the other week and I didn't have a vehicle or anything, and I just experienced the city on foot, and I was like, wow, I can see, I just feel like I'm taking in so much more than usual. I just felt so much more connected with myself and with the space that I was existing in just by walking everywhere. I wanted to ask how you feel like this kind of these ideas interact with your faith and how your research has interacted with your faith in God.
Yeah, it's really hard because now anytime I'm online, I'm thinking critically about myself and about what I'm doing and what I'm interacting with and who I'm interacting with, which I think is good. It's good, a really good first step, right? So we call that reflexivity, thinking about what you're doing yourself, and it's a really good step to kind of consider. Okay, so where is my mind going? How am I being affected emotionally? How am I behaving? How long am I spending on any particular thing? Is my attention span eroding? Am I able to read, online? Am I better suited to read paper books? So all of these are things that I'm thinking about as I'm going through the research process. And I'm also thinking, I'm just reminded of the power of community, the power of connection, and how it's a double-edged sword, right? So social media technology allows you to reach so many more people than you would have been able to reach before. But at the same time, we're still in this system confined by its parameters and its parameters of efficiency and of production. And I don't want to say exploitation, but I will say objectification, right? So everyone is an object to be used or gleaned from or useful in some way to the subject, oneself. And I think that's a really dangerous way to live out life. And so, I'm really just excited to talk about people who are finding ways around those things and through those things and finding theological resources and cultural resources to subvert those values that technological society impose upon us.
Your field work that you mentioned earlier, is that connected with what you're just saying now about talking to people who've figured out ways or different ways of navigating this space?
Yeah, that's the idea. Is to talk about the ups and downs, the positives, negatives of their experience in the digital, and definitely want to make space for acknowledging the ways that oppression manifests itself differently, right? So we know that colonialism, we talk about a colonial matrix of power, right? That constrains and constricts people's freedom. And we know that's amplified online in digital spaces. You see that in hate speech. You see that in the way recently some Maori city councilors were just detailed all the vitriol and abuse they have to go through on an everyday basis. And that's amplified, right? That's amplified by technology. Another study that I read was on deaf men and dating apps. And so on the one hand, You have this great ability to communicate and participate in this dating scene that was hitherto restricted, but they also experienced way more discrimination because they were deaf. People just saying, straight up, no, I don't want to date you or don't want to go on a date with you because you're deaf. People of color experience similar things. It's just really amazing to me. It's gotten maybe a little better now. And not on the dating apps anymore, but the amount of people who would just say like straight up like what race they were looking for on a dating app. You're like, what is this? This is bad. This is not good. And what values are we untethered from, or what have we lost? What anchors have we lost that allow us to swing into this tide?
There's something about a lack of fuzziness, or that you have to have, or maybe online you get sharper edges or something, where you can say, where there's less serendipity or something.
And again, it's just, things get collapsed from human into object. It's like I'm looking for an object to fulfill my desires, my needs, and what I want. The most successful relationships are the ones where you enter into a place of risk and vulnerability, where it's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting to fall in love with this person, but I did. And we disagree and we fight and we bicker, and that's a beautiful thing. Having disagreement is okay. And we're there to meet each other's needs, not just to satisfy our own.
There's also a weird thing about, that's very interesting to think about this stuff, but there's a weird thing about people getting, I'm thinking about my online self and stuff, it's very individual. It's like just me and my preferences and what I want to sort of present about myself. Whereas there's a whole complexity to me that's also about my immediate family and my family of origin and the communities that I'm part of, and all this sort of fuzzy complexity stuff that is not well represented when you're interacting online. I'm just thinking about being on a dating app and presenting a certain angle of yourself, and people not having to kind of deal with that, all that other stuff.
Yeah, you can choose to let people into a certain amount of your life and keep everything else distanced. And I think like that means that you pick and choose what you're presenting to someone, and you're not actually showing them the full you.
And what you're presenting is shaped by what you think will get someone else to swipe right, or message you back or do whatever. And it's both what you want, but also what you want to show. But what you want to show is shaped by what you think other people want to see. And now we have so many data points, right, that you can actually say, oh, okay, Tinder will tell you this is the photo that people are swiping on, so like put that one first.
Wow.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
There's this terrible TV show on right now called Evil. It's terrible. It's good. It's fun. It's it's a guilty pleasure, I guess. It's called Evil. It's about a priest, a psychologist, and a scientist who like try to figure out if this supernatural exists. And so they're employed by the Roman Catholic Diocese and kind of go case by case. And it's just kind of fun and goofy, sometimes serious. But this latest season is all about the algorithms and the technology, and the demons are the ones, at the TikTok-like company, feeding people content. And and it's scary because it's so close to being true, these people, these designers, they don't have nefarious intentions, or probably don't have nefarious intentions if you don't count capitalism as nefarious intention. But the way that it actually comes into use has to be considered, right? And it's not centered around humans. It's centered around economic incentives. And, by now we all know if something is free, then you are the product. You're being sold to advertisers. Your data, your views, your attention is being monetized. It still makes me feel uncomfortable.
It does make me, something you mentioned, it makes me wonder, these devices, which I'm also very plugged into, but it's almost like that I'm almost exposing myself to all the stuff that I otherwise wouldn't, that in a non-digital world, it sort of feels safer. That 3 mile an hour thing, things can get at you less in a sense at 3 miles an hour. And it kind of makes me want to just sort of throw it all away and like turn into some kind of non-digital monk. But somehow that doesn't feel like quite the right approach. I don't know. Where have you got to?
I think there's multiple right answers to this one. I really respect people who can unplug and, throw it all away and just say, we're going to step away from all social media. Yeah, multiple right answers there. It's tough.
What's another right answer apart from stepping away?
Continual self-reflection, both as an individual and as in community. critical analysis of what are these technologies doing, how are they unfolding, how are they being used, how are we using them, how are they shaping what we do. You know, I'm on this church social media group on Facebook, and the amount of people who are just looking for content to post content is staggering, you know? And it's like, look, like if you don't have content to post, then like maybe rethink your relationship with scripture, with theology, with community. You know, the invitation to church has always been get something exciting to happen and then invite your friends, right? Like if nothing's exciting is happening at your church, maybe rethink what you're doing at church. You know, and if you're not getting excited enough about going to church that, you know, that's like a place you'd want to bring someone, then maybe rethink what's happening or your views around it, or, you know, yeah. So I think, yeah, I think it's easier to critique the bad ways of doing things than it is to show the good, right ways. I always just try to find people I respect and admire, and then just try to copy what they do, or think, you know, okay, what would they do, right? G.K. Chesterton has this great quote talking about St. Francis, and he says, you know, we always think the saints were just so like Jesus, so beyond what humans could do. But insofar as St. Francis was like Jesus, Jesus was like St. Francis, meaning the similarities go both ways, you know, and Jesus was fully human and he lived a human life, and that's an attainable life. It's not something that's out of reach. And so seeing those people who are living godly lives, who are anchoring their values and anchoring their activity on digital platforms in their values, whatever religion that may be. You know, most of my friends tend to be Christian, just from the circles I've run in and been in. But seeing that play out online is really encouraging. You know, rejecting misinformation, rejecting that urge to be outraged at every little thing. Just acknowledging that truth and beauty are in this world and they're real. Love is good, hate is bad. You know, like as some things as simple as that. Finding those people who are living that out is yeah, it's a good thing.
Can you tell us about these focus groups you're looking at and how you think that they can inform the way that we approach technology and kind of inform this whole like what you're just talking about here, right? The development of like figuring out how to interact with technology.
Yeah. So it's kind of long been acknowledged, right, that everyone experiences the digital in a different way. And we've spoken about that a little bit. And there are different ways and specific ways, right? So we got to look at the particular ways that people experience the digital world in different ways. And so by looking at, I'm going to try to cover 4 different groups in my research. We'll see kind of what actually happens. But by studying with Indigenous Maori Christians, Samoan migrant Christians, queer Christians, and deaf Christians, it gives us into a lens of indigeneity, of migration, what it's like to be, you know, speaking non-English in a very English-dominated industry and world, what it means to kind of be on the fringes, on the margins, like queer Christians are, of Christianity itself. And with deaf Christians, it kind of opens up lenses into material bodies and disabilities and differences of abilities, and how we all experience the world differently in those ways. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I want to do these focus groups or workshops is just to think critically and think theologically with these groups. And, you know, there's been a lot of reflection, I think, individually and maybe corporately, but putting those things in conversation with each other, I think is really important, right? Like it's through, like diversity for the sake of diversity doesn't really help us, right? Diversity, when it helps shape each other, when it helps encourage each other and inspire each other, like that's the beauty of it, you know? Like we're not just here for some politics of representation. We're here to actually look and see, okay, how are you living out your call to be a Christian in this world? And how does that resonate with my call to be a Christian in this world based on who I am, where I've been born, where I'm living, what gifts I've been given, you know, who I am as a human, who I am physically. Yeah.
So good. When I was in Cambodia, I was reading Huia Come Home by J. Ducat, kind of learning about the story of New Zealand and how missions looked at kind of as Aotearoa was being colonized. And I think, what do you call it? Like my takeaway from those kind of parallel journeys was this realization that, oh my goodness, I have so much to learn from Khmer culture and from Māori culture and from all cultures that exist around me. Anybody or any group who is not me or has not had the same upbringing, I have things to learn from them. But also I do have things to offer them, and I have to acknowledge that too. And that's the beauty of relationship with people who are different to you, is like this beautiful kind of tapestry of different experiences and this dance of like learning to live at peace with one another and learn from one another, rather than just like constantly, rub each other the wrong way. Like it's actually just about having the humility to realize that people with different worldviews and life journeys have so much to teach us. That's why I love what you're talking about with these different theologies that, we can take help and advice and insight from, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And do you have a hunch that the internet, digitality, social media and stuff has got an interesting role to play across those four communities?
Yeah, it's the world we live in, you know? Everyone I've talked to has been connected to technology in some way, whether that's email, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, or something. And so, you know, even if we're not thinking about it, it's there. When I tell people this, they're like, oh, okay, we'll get these young people in to tell you about the technology. They're like, no, I'm interested in that. I am. But I'm also just really interested in the people who are, 60 plus, 70, 80. Like, what is your experience of technology? How do you feel included? Especially with the demographics of the church right now, right? In Aotearoa, it tends to be pretty old. You know, how have you been included in lockdowns? How have you been excluded? Do you feel comfortable online? Do you feel at home online? Do you feel like you're missing out? Do you feel like you can get accurate information? You know, how do you connect with your grandkids? How do they support you in this? How does your church support you in this? You know, we talk so much about ethics and living a Christian life, but I have yet to hear maybe one sermon, but a sermon, like a series of sermons on how to live in a digital world, what it means to love your neighbor online, what it means to be a light online, and I think there's this, the evangelicals do this really well. And in the US, they, just post Bible verses every day or share Christian memes, I guess. And I think there's something beyond that, right? Like that's fine. That's good. It's a right way to do things, but it doesn't get back into that technological philosophy, right? That technique where everything is still being commoditized and objectified and performative. So yeah, how do we get beyond that? How do we get into a deeper ground, I guess, of connection and of hope, of love?
What do you think it means to love your neighbor online?
Oh man, yeah. Jesus's question, answer to this question, right? Or Jesus, wait, how does it go? Story of Good Samaritan, the guy comes up and says, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, love your neighbor. Yeah. What does it mean to love your neighbor? You got to ask, who's my neighbor? So is my neighbor the kid in the DRC who's digging out these precious metals to put in my iPhone? Is my neighbor the young black man who's getting targeted by artificial intelligence systems in South LA? Is my neighbor random Twitter follower that I might, have in common? And all of these are my neighbors, right? And so all of these things have to go into the conversation of what it means and how it means to love your neighbor online. The earth, right? The care of creation. Can you love your neighbor? How do you love your neighbor in countries that are literally sinking because of climate change or who are literally dying of heat waves because of our advancements in technology? These are all, I think, really important questions to be asking when we think about that question of what does it mean to love your neighbor? Like one transaction on Bitcoin, I'm thinking this is right. You can fact check this later, but one transaction, right? So you do one transaction of Ethereum or whatever is the same amount of energy as a single household in the US uses for an entire year. Yeah. So like, and like the Bitcoin, that whole industry, it takes more energy than all of the aviation industry. So, this like promise of the blockchain and Web 3.0, like there's a huge cost, a huge energy cost. And yeah, we don't talk about that. We just think, oh yeah, it's all just
Online. So it can't
online. We don't
possibly be.
see it. Yeah, yeah. Same with internet servers, right? And there's this big question of data sovereignty here in Aotearoa and with Indigenous peoples. Like, who owns the data? Where is the data stored? Do I have access to the data? It's a really important question to be asking.
What about the guy who is formed by extremist online presence and then goes and shoots up a store or a mosque? Is he my neighbor?
Absolutely. 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 And this sort of gets really tricky, right? Because there's this article in The Atlantic from this year or from this week, and it talks about trickle down influencers. So influencers, right, will do thoughts and prayers or like say something, and it shapes how the rest of social media responds to these things that have nothing to do with us. You know, they do with, and the fact that we have shared humanity and shared culture, shared civilization, shared society. But, you know, like so few people, right, have any actual connection to tragedies that might happen around the world, and we all like want to respond. We want to like gush out and say like our hearts are with these people, and I think that's good. It is good, but I think we have to acknowledge that we're being shaped and constrained and contained by these systems and structures and infrastructures that we have around us. And I think there's humanity and human responses that often get lost in those kinds of things, right? So you see maybe an article about like, oh yeah, and this person forgives the shooter, and you just immediately jump into a debate about whether or not it's right to forgive, or what does that mean for people who don't forgive. And you know, it's like, it's a good thing to talk about, but it's none of our business. You know, I think there is a lot of work to be done in combating extremism, both on platforms, and there is some work you can do individually. I think it's really, really hard to combat the flow of information and misinformation and disinformation that goes unchecked online.
I feel like I saw on your LinkedIn profile something about a job that you had being a fact checker or a fake news analyst or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so when my wife and I were living in Ecuador and we were both working just remote jobs, so basically the company that I worked for is contracted out by one of the big social media companies that I'm not legally allowed to say which one it is. You know, you like click, okay, like report as fake news or whatever, report as misinformation, and then it goes to one of us, low, like $10 an hour people who just say, okay, does this, you know, correspond to anything that is a reliable source? You know, reliable sources being government websites or maybe AP News or some other reputable journalistic article. In 2020, in the lead up to the US presidential election and the pandemic, I just couldn't do it anymore. It was just too soul crushing to see all this content. So I bowed out of that. But it was really interesting to see. There's so many articles and so much information that has that kernel of truth, right? It's, you take that kernel of truth and you push it into a whole mountain of opinion. And it's really hard to fact check that because there's nothing wrong with the facts as presented, but the extrapolation and the opinions and everything behind it is just, can be demeaning. And yeah.
So for that kind of content, would you, in that job, have had to say, no, this is not misinformation? It might be a very bad way of presenting these facts, but it actually is not misinformation.
Yeah, you'd say that's not misinformation. Yeah. Because of our news cycles, right? Everything everyone says somehow becomes important. And so it's like some official somewhere says, oh yeah, like someone ate a bat or someone stole a bat. And then that's the news that's being reported on. Not, is this a credible theory? But, oh yeah, that this like general said this thing that may or may not be true, which makes it really hard. Yeah, really hard to identify, you know, what's true, what's false. And
these days I feel like people could even argue that what is and isn't a reputable source is also subjective.
Absolutely. You know, and that's been going on for ages, but heightened, you know, with fake news and just that term, right? That something can just be fake news and that all of mainstream media can be lying to us, which could be true, but I don't know. I just don't find it very plausible, you know? leaks happen, and it's very hard to keep things contained. Yeah.
But this does point to an interesting aspect of this whole conversation to me, is that so much of these social media companies and the technological forces that are sort of shaping our digital experience are all in one little spot in the world, Southern California, with a sideline in China via TikTok, but most of it is Southern California.
Yeah. I will say, yeah, in the sense that there's a few people making decisions that affect disproportionately huge number of people. Like, yeah, the intentions and the outcomes can wildly be out of sync. You know, you can think, oh yeah, we're gonna like just solve climate change by giving like ride sharing programs, and then instead you have people just driving around aimlessly, you know, burning petrol, waiting to pick up someone so that they can eat for the day. And we don't have a whole lot of ethicists and philosophers constraining these discussions and these policies. And we don't even have, you know, politicians. The fact that in the US, at least, like all of our politicians are, most of our politicians are pretty ancient. You know, you just watch the Senate hearings and stuff where they interview Zuckerberg, and you're just like, what are you talking about? You know, you got the senator being like, well, are you going to remove the Finsta? And they're like, that's not how it works. You know, like you can't remove someone creating a fake account. Like you can crack down on that maybe, but like that's not what Finsta does. Nothing. You know, it's not a technological component. It's a thing people do. And
what was that word?
Finsta, a fake Instagram. Yeah. So, but just listening to, you know, these senators like try to create policy and respond is just like heartbreaking. You're like, I have no doubt that, you know, they have good intentions, they're good people, but you know, like some staffer just did not do the work of like translating like what needs to be asked to like what needs to be done.
How did you, this is a bit of a tangent, but how did you get onto this journey like of exploring theology, faith, technology? How did you get into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was doing my bachelor's, there is a professor who came to my dorm floor to give a talk, and his talk was all about how media as an environment shapes what we do, how we think, how we behave. And I was just fascinated. I was just really taken. My dorm mates, my roommates, we are all really just like, oh, whoa, you know, we haven't thought about this before. And so that Lent, we gave up all digital media for Lent. So 40 days, you know, wow. Like no video games, no TV. This is when Netflix was still a disc in the mail. So it wasn't, you know, that hard. We were all 18 and, you know, really, really passionate about being good people. And there's this sense of, I think, the sense of moral superiority, but also the sense of connection and how connected we felt to each other, how connected we felt to, you know, to God, even through that. I don't want to say like sacrifice, but through that fasting journey. Yeah. And so I took every class I could with this guy, Reed Schuchart is his name. I just, fell in love with media studies, and we ended up going on a study abroad trip to Europe, Germany and Switzerland, and looking at the media effects from the printing press, printing revolution and the Reformation, and then similarly the propaganda campaign and the technological influences in World War II. Yeah, so just, really, really interesting stuff. Yeah, I've just kind of been curious about it ever since.
And you started at Wheaton College?
That's it, Wheaton College, yeah.
And then Princeton?
And then Princeton Theological Seminary, that's right. Yeah.
And now here?
Yeah.
I remember in our course, Michael was my lecturer in a violence and peacemaking religious studies course. I remember you mentioning that you were there during the Boston Marathon bombing. Your dad was. I wondered if you would be comfortable with kind of sharing a bit more about your experience when that happened, and kind of how you see that one shaped you and your views on kind of violence and peacemaking, but two, how you see technology maybe as a part of that story at all.
Yeah. So in 2013, my dad ran the Boston Marathon. It was not his first time, maybe second, third, maybe fourth time. And I was in Jersey at the time, doing my MDiv. And so I went up to Boston, which is maybe 5-hour drive, something like that. Yeah. And then so I was with my mom, and we saw my dad turn the final corner, And then maybe 4 or 5 minutes later, we like heard these big explosions. We kind of looked and like saw some big puffs of smoke. And this is Boston. People are, all about the American Revolution. There's like, we had just done this whole like, American Revolution tour. I'm like, oh, does this look some kind of like weird colonial reenactment? Are they like shooting off cannons or something? And then this guy like ran past being like, there's a bomb, everybody run. And still I'm like, like, is this just a panic? Like, do we need to panic right now? But, we're like, okay, well, we should probably like go back to the hotel and where we're supposed to meet up my dad and wait there. And my mom was like, no, we need to go to the finish line. I'm like, no, that's like the last place we want to be right now if there is a bomb. Yeah, so we went back to the hotel, and there on Twitter, I saw, reports of 2 bombs going off on the Boston Marathon and the finish line. And, from the time and stuff, you get like the chips and whatever. So my dad crossed, I think, 2 minutes before the bombs went off. Yeah, and so he wasn't there on the finish line. He had kind of gone through that section, through the aid tents and everything, and was already back, kind of on his way back to the hotel at that point. But yeah, and it was interesting to me to think, okay, yeah, like I didn't trust the guy like yelling bombs, like running past me, but somehow I trusted Twitter. The other thing that happened was that all the cell networks got overloaded because everyone is calling and texting, and the cell towers just aren't set up for that. And I don't know if they are now, but it was, interesting that like when you need technology the most, when you need to get in touch with people, like it just doesn't work. So I was, on the hotel Wi-Fi, just like, scrolling Twitter and trying to figure out what was going on. Yeah. And, we couldn't get in touch with my dad, and we just kind of waited for him to show up.
You didn't know that he was safe then?
No, but judging by like the size of the bombs and the size, like kind of the sounds of the explosions, like it didn't look like it was like a whole cluster bomb had gone off, and it was enough time kind of like since my dad had passed away, like, okay, like he's probably fine. Like it's going to be okay. Yeah. I think the other side of the story though is, out of, I don't know if it's curiosity or just, interest, I started researching the bombers and their motivation and the kind of their stories and what led to this kind of radicalization. And there's both the technological aspect, but there's also the globalization aspect of not finding a place to belong, finding that community that sits around and talks about ideas and wants to be right and get things right. And, I grew up Southern Baptist where we were obsessed with getting things right, we never threw bombs at anybody, but have done, other horrible things the Southern Baptist Convention has, and Southern Baptist churches and Southern Baptist Christians. But, the hurt that we can throw by clinging to this circle of saying, no, we're right. We've got it right. Everyone else has got it wrong. Our way is, the right way, and we'll do whatever we can to show that. And I guess, that power, right, of connection and belonging, and how that can be a force for good or for evil.
What did they want, the Boston Marathon bombers?
Hard to say, really hard to say. Yeah, kind of unclear on what they actually wanted. Yeah. But yeah, I think basically, just to get back at the US, I guess, Another interesting thing about this story, though, technologically, is the whole hunt for the bombers, right? There was a young man he was a person of color. He was brown. I don't remember his exact ethnicity, but he was missing at the time. His family had filed like a missing persons report. And so all these people on Reddit were like going through the footage and being like, there's citizen surveillance and citizen investigation and stuff, and being like, okay, this guy had a backpack in this CCTV footage, but he didn't in this one. And, we think it looks like this other guy who's missing. And they just get it completely wrong. And, and then this person's family is getting like bombarded with like death threats, and, they're not even Muslim, and they're going through this whole thing of like, oh my God, like our child is missing. We don't know where he is. And then they're put through this agony. So that's one side of the story, right? It gets out, and then it gets published. Someone tweets, and then it just runs and has a life of its own. On the other side of it, though, the Reddit moderators did everything right, and the system worked democratically in the way it should, where people who were doing these crazy theories and speculations got downvoted like really quickly, and the people who were making really hateful and discriminatory comments got downvoted or removed or moderated. And so, it shows that even when the system is working, the human drive for vengeance or for hate or to blame is still let loose in the world. we were talking earlier about nonviolent movements, and the power of a nonviolent movement to stay nonviolent is just incredible, right? It's pretty easy to be, a person in a violent regime and to not commit violence, just to abstain, but to keep everybody from giving into that human impulse to lash out, to throw a punch, to do something like that. It's really, really difficult. What we saw at the protest here in New Zealand, right, at the parliament, I don't know if it was lack of leadership or lack of COPOP or whatever it was, right? There wasn't that person or persons or COPOP in that movement to keep things nonviolent. And it's a very human thing, right? It's a very human thing to become violent. And you just see that exacerbated online, and it gets amplified and radiates out in ways that are unspeakably tragic.
It's hard, right? Like, even if there had been like a really solid kaupapa of non-violence, as soon as the police arrive and start to move people from the area, it doesn't matter if like all of the protesters themselves were to surrender and put hands up. I feel like there still would have been people step into that space who just have beef with the police and potentially get violent on protesters' behalf, as kind of using it as an opportunity, to like lash out. There's also a tricky like around, we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And I've been grappling since doing religious studies of like, there's all of these wonderful religions which you see really peaceful versions and really not peaceful versions. And how do I know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that the only way to God is through him? And then kind of came to the conclusion of like, well, if I believe that he died and was resurrected, then like that just changes it all. If he died and was resurrected, then everything that he said is true, which means that he is the way, the truth, and the life, right? But there's still that kind of grapple with like, if I believe that my way is the right way or the thing that I believe is the right thing, then there's still that tendency to be like, well, I've got the answer, and to want to impose that on others. I'm not keen to be that guy, but how do you live out a faith in believing that this is the right one without it being somewhat colonial?
I think one of the greatest gifts we have in scripture is that there is no, the ends never justify the means, right? And I think that colonial impulse, right, is to come in and say, these heathens are going to hell unless they become Christians. And they're not going to become Christians unless we colonize them and civilize them and turn them back from their barbaric ways. That was the colonial idea, right? The ends justified the means. So by whatever means necessary, we're going to get these heathens into heaven. But we don't see warrant for that in scripture, right? We see this lack of logic. We see this lack of calculus. We see Jesus saying, now I'm going to leave behind the 99 to go search for the one lost sheep. I'm going to be like the woman who looks for the lost coin. It's about, following Christ, following a way of love, a reckless way of love, as Dorothy Day would say. And by doing that, you create an invitation and not a conquest, I guess, over others.
What do you notice about, you've lived in quite a few different places, sounds like.
Yeah.
What do you notice about New Zealand and the contrast with your place of origin and stuff?
One of the great things about New Zealand is the treaty and its commitment to biculturalism. There's such a long way to go. But in the US, in Texas especially, we don't even talk about indigenous people, stereotypes run rampant. I couldn't tell you what, tribes lived in my place of birth before colonization happened. And that's a big gift. I think New Zealand, due to its size and leadership, is pretty flexible and pretty quick to act, which is something I really admire. The way that Jacinda and the government responded after the Christchurch mall shootings, banning firearms, gosh, I wish the US could do something like that. Man, what a dream. I think, it's funny, right? There's just a lot of stories we tell ourselves about the places we come from. And, some of those stories and myths have basis in reality. Some of them don't. And yeah, I think there's a lot of really good stories about New Zealand and what it is to be, a Kiwi. Aspirational stories. Yeah. The one thing that I think is really cool is like, the Rainbow Warrior and the whole anti-nuclear movement, and the way that New Zealand owns that as part of its history, and now almost every New Zealander looks on that with pride. But when it was happening, like it was very contested. There were bitter debates about that. However, I do think that, that whole movement has led some people down the maybe false equivalency between nuclear submarines and nuclear arms and nuclear power. Yeah, I don't know.
Have you heard of Shane Claiborne? I love him, adore him. And I saw this thing on his Instagram recently where he and some friends went into the, what's it called? The rifle?
The NRA. Yeah.
Went into the NRA prayer meeting one morning and started reading out the names of people who had been affected by gun violence and families, and saying, what were they saying? They said, Lord have mercy. They'd read out a name and then they'd say, Lord have mercy. Just such a beautiful non-violent act of being like, I mean, this is what your guns are doing, Yeah.
What happened next? Do you know?
They got removed. Yeah.
Yeah. No, he's his book Irresistible Revolution was like, transformative for me when I was a teen. Yeah.
What did it do for you, Michael?
So I think, his passion and his drive to live out his faith in an authentic way and in a radical way, and in a way that was different, right? I think, so much of my Christianity was kind of baptizing a certain way of living, right? A culture, and saying, oh yeah, this is like, what God wants. And that's fine. It's okay to just like want to make money, and, and maybe it is. But Shane, said, no, like the goal is not to make money. The goal is to live among people who are poor, who need help, who need God, who need Jesus. And when you do that and you're faithful to a call and faithful to a community, then beautiful things can happen and transformation can happen. And when you open yourself up to the Holy Spirit, then things can change and people can change. And that was really beautiful to me. I think what was really hard, and we're seeing this now, right? You have to say one thing before you can say the next. And I think that was the first word that needed to be said. The second word that needs to be said, right, is that change is really difficult. Transformation is really difficult. You've got to show up again and again and again, and it gets tiring and it gets exhausting. And we have to tell those stories too of failure and failure and failure and failure and failure, of trying to help people and trying to help people get onto the right track. And that's a story that's not as sexy to tell, not as inspiring to hear or to read. And that, I think, kind of put not a damper, but, like it's just really hard work. And acknowledging that it's really hard and difficult work is important.
My pastor has been saying this really cool thing lately, this quote that's like, love is it's a rugged commitment to someone, for them, and with them unto their transformation, so that they can then live out a rugged commitment to those around them, to be for them and with them unto their transformation. I just think it's such a beautiful way of looking at love. Is like, it's actually like you're committed to that individual or to that group of people, and it's rugged. Like, it can be really hard, but that the purpose of your rugged commitment is to see transformation begin to happen in the lives of that person and the people around them. And I just think, yeah, that's a powerful picture of real love, I think, is you've got to do the hard with people.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Like we talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. So easy to stop for someone and be like, okay, I'm going to help you out and go on your way. Never see you again. Like, good luck, have good life. That's the easy part of Christianity. That's the easy part of loving your neighbor. Like showing up, for that person who just like keeps getting drunk or keeps doing drugs or keeps making self-sabotaging decisions. That's the hard part. That's that rugged love, and that's just as important, if not more important, than that Good Samaritan act.
I think I would say that over time we have, in this particular society, thinking aloud, have developed systems where we feel that it's not acceptable to have people eating on this side of the street, and we've tried to make structures and health systems and welfare systems and stuff that make that less likely. And I think that impulse has quite a lot to do with Jesus' difference in the world.
Yeah. And you could probably argue, like, maybe it's not like a physical bleeding we're talking about anymore. Maybe there's a different kind of being beaten up and left on the side of the road that doesn't look so physical and tangible.
For me, that's that story. Partly, I take it as an invitation or a challenge to be the neighbour, like, turn up.
Yeah. To see past difference.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. Technology really helps us sometimes with that.
And hinders.
And
right?
hinders.
Yeah. Because I do think there's a huge difference, right? Because we see people bleeding on the side of the road on Facebook, on Twitter, quite often. But there's little we can actually maybe materially do, maybe someone supposed to give a little, and if it was someone face to face, you'd be like, okay, look, like, I'm going to help you out. I'll help you with childcare. I'll help you, I'll babysit your kids, or I'll help, like lend you my car, or that kind of thing. But when someone on the other side of the world, it's just like, what do you do? How do I love my neighbor? How do I love this person? And then enough of those things happen, right? Where you're just like, oh, well, I can't do anything. And then I just move on with my day and don't do anything.
How do you stay sane in the face of that and all the other different aspects of sort of craziness and need that the online world kind of presents you and us? How do you stay sane?
Yeah, I think you concentrate on one thing. You concentrate on a few things, and the immediate community around you. There's that prayer attributed to is it Richard Neighbour, Reinhold Neighbour, one of the neighbors, that they say at the AA meetings, you've got to have some kind of wisdom to discern the difference between what you can change and what you can't. I tend to lean towards the camp that says, God is in control, and God definitely acts through us, and we should do all we can to make this world a better place and to bring God's kingdom here on earth. But also, at the end of the day, salvation of the world is God's responsibility, not ours. And I think also having faith in your fellow humans, thinking, okay, like, by and large, our fellow humans are going to pursue beauty and justice and love in the face of evil and adversity, and it's not all up to us. It's not just an individual thing. Yeah, finding community, I think, is really helpful for me. Being able to be anchored in, a group of people who support each other and exemplify that love.
Have you found community in New Zealand?
Yeah, I have. There's people at church, kind of good friends too, just around. Yeah, and then technology too. I've got a couple of group chats from friends from high school even, and from uni. Yeah, it's different, but it's part of the migrant experience, right?
You have been lecturing religious studies. What's the benefit of studying religious studies?
Yeah. So I think religious studies, so I'm not trained in religious studies. I do, we called it like world Christianity or something at seminary, and where we kind of looked at other religions and stuff. So I'm not trained in religious studies, and it's been a huge opportunity for me to learn more and read more outside of what I normally read and what I normally focus on. And I think there's a lot of beauty in comparison, right? So, you mentioned, how do we know like ours is the right way, and having some kind of humility and looking at other religions and the way other people do things and see the world and seeing the power and the beauty in that. I think that's really important. I think the historical aspect is really important as well. So to look at history of religions, see where religions come from, kind of dispel some of these myths about religion, in an age where we're bombarded with image and information. Jacques Ellul says, we go to these explanatory myths. Neil Postman, who's a scholar at NYU, passed away a while ago now, but he says that in the face of information overload, our brain resorts to pattern recognition. And we know that those can be forces for good, right? It can help us as humans evolutionarily to survive. We see something rustling in the bushes, we're like, that means something bad, that's a bad thing, we're gonna run. But now we see someone who's not quite like us, and we're like, we gotta run, we gotta move away. And I think the power of religious studies and the historical context lets us look at those explanatory myths that we like prop up that says, oh, it's just all, the far right's fault or the alt-right's fault, or, oh, it's just all these anti-vaxxers' fault, or, oh, it's all these like libs and whatever, it's all their fault. It helps us break down those myths and look at the particularities of religions and the particularities in the history and movements and how things happened, why things happened, and to reach beyond those myths and to reach beyond that pattern recognition and say, okay, there's something beautiful in this. There's something beautiful in the humanity and the sociality and the anthropology here. And finding that is really exciting and inspiring. And also, it's one of the only places, religious studies where you can really grapple with these questions that have to do with existence. So what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to live a fulfilling life, to live a flourishing life? And to look at the different ways that people over the ages have looked at that over time in different spaces is really cool. I don't know, that probably maybe like other people asking, what does it mean to be human? But not in the same way, I think.
I guess circling back a little bit, what the online world, social media stuff, is kind of doing to us in religion and in politics and in the way we see other people and we see the world stuff, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Where do you see hope in all of it?
So I think the way I start as a media scholar, I start with kind of those enemies of hope, right? So the Episcopal Bishop of Texas, Andy Doyle, he was at a conference a few years ago that I went to, and he said, nostalgia is the enemy of hope. So, what he meant by that is like looking back to the good old days and trying to get back to that is not the way we move forward. It's not the way we imagine a new thing happening, in the newness of the kingdom of God coming about. And I think, that's one of those explanatory myths, like, oh, if we could just get back to those good old days, if we could just get back to, axing out all technology or, the nuclear family or whatever it was, these myths, right? These things that never really were. If we could just get back to that, then we can bring God's kingdom here on earth. So I think these explanatory myths are a big enemy of hope. I think a singular vision of society similarly is a killer of hope. When you just think my way is the right way. If we just do it my way, if we just do it this way, then everything will be solved. And we just see in history time and again with whether it's a society or a government or religion, like just humans are going to be humans and there's no silver bullet singular solution. So I think those are enemies of hope. Where I find hope in all of this is comfort in the sovereignty of God, right? So God is omnipotent in all of this. If God's hand is on this world, and I believe it is, then God will work all things for the good of those who love God. And God will bring God's kingdom here on earth. Oh, and it will be beautiful and it will be loving. In theology, we talk about having this bifocal vision, right? So you have to look to the end, look to the kingdom of God where it's fully realized, but you also have to look here and now and say, okay, well, what are the injustices and the oppressions and all of those things that are happening here and now? And how do we address those while also keeping one eye on the end, on the telos? And I think that's really important. I think we don't have to be singular. We can be multiple. We can be bifocal. We can look at more than two things at once. We can say, oh yeah, like the world's a really crappy place to be sometimes and often, and it can be, but also there's some real beauty in it. And when that beauty, we do see that beauty, it's just a taste of the end breaking of the kingdom of God. I think the other thing that's really encouraging to me, and we touched on earlier, is that there is no kind of logic or calculus in how we can make the world a better place. It defies logic. It defies human reason. Paul talks about this. It's foolishness to the wise. It doesn't really make sense. Yeah, and the call is to be faithful. The call is not to necessarily even to change the world. It's just to be faithful to God and to be a witness and to love and to do that rugged love and make the changes where we can. And I was reading someone's Twitter feed earlier today and was talking about 1st and 2nd Samuel and how in the systems that were set up when Eli was priest, and Eli wasn't a great guy, his sons weren't great, they were defrauding people, eating the temple sacrifices, like sleeping with people serving at the temple, like not great. And then the monarch comes and you're like, okay, well, is this going to be the new system that like saves everything? And no, we know the answer, of course, is no. Like Saul was pretty bad. David was like kind of okay, but also like pretty bad at a lot of things. And this idea that injustice will still happen no matter what system of power is in place is both, I think I find comfort in the biblical reality, the scriptures acknowledging that this is the reality of humans, this is the reality of power structures of society, and yet still God can act, and yet still God will act in and through people and humans, and God will and still act in humans today. And it doesn't matter if it's capitalism or if it's communism or social democratic liberalism or whatever it is. There's still going to be injustices in this world, but God still will act and work in and through people.
And do you, with that kind of bifocal vision talk about, do you see a role for technology somewhere in there for the online digitality world?
Yeah. I think it just needs to kind of undergo constant analysis. I think one of the biggest things that technology does is that it distracts us. People have written a lot about this, about how our attention span is just completely eroded and destroyed because of technology. Really hard to say, kind of unethical to experiment on. We do know that, in the US at least, like the average attention span of a high schooler, what they spend time on is, the average is 65 seconds, right? So that's not a lot of time. The median is 19 seconds. The median amount of time on any one task is 19 seconds. For office workers, it's about 3 minutes. I think there is hope here. I think that hope comes from putting our attention on God. I think technology can help that, but I think we need to figure out, our relationship with God and fixing our attention on God first. And then, and only then, can technology come into play in the unfolding of the kingdom of God.
You mentioned reading The Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne and that being formative for you. Do you have any other books that you've read or that you are reading that you think are worth kind of mentioning?
Another one that really sticks with me is Dorothy Day's Reckless Way of Love. She was kind of the founder of the Catholic Catholic workers movement in New York, and she's just, super badass. If you've got 2 coats, you're stealing it from the poor. Every time I open my closet, I'm like, oof. So that, that kind of stuff really, really, that kind of saintliness, I think, is really inspiring and really convicting, and trying to figure out, a way to live with that call and live with those words and still participate in society is really difficult. I just finished this book called False Divides by Lana Lopesi. So she takes the metaphor of the Moana, the ocean, as a connecting vector, that all these civilizations like Australia, New Zealand, the islands, Taiwan even, we're all connected by the ocean. And she says the internet can be like that. It can be a place to reconnect and reimagine society together in a Moana way. Really short, really easy read, really accessible read too. Some other stuff on media studies specifically. There's a great little conference at Princeton Theological Seminary a few years ago, maybe 2020, 2019, where they talked about theologies of the digital. And there's a couple of talks. I think they're all recorded on YouTube or something if you search. And the transcripts are available as well. They're not really transcripts. They're like the papers that were, associated with the talk. But Hannah Reichel has a really great talk about surveillance systems and AI and comparing that to God's knowledge and all knowledge and, foreknowledge. And then Kate Ott, who's just a wonderful, wonderful theologian. She's got this talk on how feminist theology has always been relational and interdependent and multiple, and how that can lead us into a better place into thinking about the digital age. And the other writer that I'm really just obsessed with right now is Natalie Wigg Stevenson. She's a theologian up in Toronto, and her recent book is called Transgressive Devotion. And she looks at performance artworks and then looks at different theological perspectives. And it's just wild, it's just absolutely wild. She talks about this performance art where this guy shoots his friend, and what does that mean for us as Christians? And we don't know if that guy intentionally shot him. Was he supposed to miss? Where is he supposed to shoot him? All of this stuff, but recorded, and it's available. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. She has this great talk, this quote where she says, theologians are just obsessed with orthodoxy, but I just want to pick up these ideas and these things and just play with them a little bit longer, hold on to them a little bit longer before putting them down. So really, really cutting edge stuff, really opens up the way we think about God. Like she starts off by thinking, well, what if God had Alzheimer's? What do it mean if we had a forgetful God? And yeah, just really cool stuff. So Natalie Wick Stevenson, I really love her writing. Yeah, accessible too, really easy to read. Are y'all reading anything good?
I'm a little bit obsessed with this science fiction author, Gene Wolfe. And I just picked up a couple of his books from Brooklyn Library yesterday. You mentioned Chesterton earlier, also a little bit obsessed with, and cannot let go of that obsession. I'm listening to his his biography by Maisie Ward, I think her name is. And Gene Wolfe he died a couple of years ago, but he was Chesterton obsessed as well. And it's very interesting to see, just at this stage of life, starting to see, I guess, the authors turning up in other people's works, and the kind of echoes of people that kind of travel through books, and the way the books sort of talk to each other is a weird and interesting thing to me. Yeah. Are you reading anything, Rachel?
Rain and I are reading Religious Feminist Activist, and it's this anthropologist. She looks at these kind of different focus groups some pagan, some Catholic, some more evangelical Christian, and the way that they kind of interact with like activism, and the way that their feminism informs that. I also watched this Netflix series, which I must recommend, called God's Favorite Idiot. Have you seen it? Oh, it's so funny. And I thought it was real interesting as a religious studies student, because this guy starts glowing and finds out that he's meant to be this like messenger of the message of God, and he's like meant to get out the message, but he doesn't know what the message is.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, highly recommend.
Cool. Check it out.
Yeah. I see that you're wearing a hoodie which says Free West Papua, and it's got a very, I don't know if they look passionate, I would say. They're yelling, and there's, I'm guessing, West Papua flag.
Yeah, riddled with some bullets and some chains that are being broken. I didn't even know about West Papua, and then I landed in Melbourne February 2019 to meet my partner, now wife, then partner. And I get off the plane, and I've got like my big bag, and she's like, all right, we're going to go to the Indonesian embassy to this Free West Papua protest. And so we go, we meet all these West Papuan refugees, and we just kind of fell in with them. And I worked with the University of Wellington in Melbourne on this project on spiritual healing in West Papua. And my wife was working on this petition to take to the Australian Senate, which got tabled to bring a motion to the UN to grant West Papua autonomy and sovereignty over their state. So basically what happened is, Papua New Guinea is the eastern half of that big island, right? So the west half is West Papua, currently occupied and colonized by Indonesia. So the Dutch left in the 50s, 60s, and then days later, Indonesia came in and basically invaded and has been occupying West Papua ever since. And there's a lot of resources there. There's a lot of land, a lot of forest, a lot of natural resources, some gold. And so they've been very reluctant to give up the territory. And so working with the West Papuan refugees, a lot of them came over on a boat from West Papua and got lost at sea, and then eventually did end up making it to Australia. And just hearing their stories, and because of the Dutch missionaries, a lot of them are very strongly Christian, and they're very passionate about their faith. And so we are working to try to provide and find theological resources to support this movement for liberation, that supports peace and love and nonviolence, and also the realities of violent struggle and violent occupation. Yeah, so definitely Medika Papua, Free West Papua. It's a issue that kind of flies under the radar, and it's just in our backyard, And just recently, Indonesia just cut all the scholarship funding for all West Papuan students, and so anyone who is abroad all their scholarship money just got cut. And so, right now the activists here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, are working on fundraising to try to provide for these students who are, studying and in Aotearoa and have no funding anymore.
So yeah, if you can give a little, there's some campaigns circulating around. If you Google that, then you should be able to find.
Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It's been really wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me and letting me ramble a little bit and work through some of these ideas. It's been fun.
Totally. Yeah. So interesting.